So let's proceed. This is obviously a kind of an informal session we've asked Larry to kind of start the ball rolling, but this is a kind of a free-for-all. What did we call it? Reminiscence Roundtable. We don't even have a round table. We decided to be a round table.
We don't even have a table.
So you can imagine the table.
Oh, you can see it.
When Steve mentioned the Nadia Boulanger event we did in 2004, and we had people here from every single decade of her teaching from the 1930s to the 20s to 70s. And it was the stories that were told were astonishing. So I'm perhaps we will have similar kinds of stories. And I think stream of consciousness is probably the best way to go on this. Anybody either?
It's Donald Trump time.
It's not. Did Donald know George Lynn? I mean,
Very much down. Are we ready to go?
take it away.
Well, I thought a good way for us to begin, because you all heard how I studied with Dr. Lynn, and I know the two of you work much more closely with him than did I as far as vocal stuff. I thought maybe we could start with you just telling us how you got associated and how you started singing.
You started earlier. Go ahead. When I was 16, my mother got a phone call from a wonderful baritone, Theodore Bradshaw, who had been a member of the George Lynn Singers. And he told her, my mother was, among other things, had a wonderful contralto voice, that George Lynn was returning to Colorado. And the first major thing that he was doing the summer of 1970 was serving as the guest conductor of the University of Denver's summer choir and resident composer, various things, and that the University of Denver was inviting members of the adult musical community to supplement the students to form a full 200 to 300 voice symphonic choir. And so my mother was intrigued about this and called up the head of the Lamont School of Music and asked if I might also be able to participate, even though I had just finished my sophomore year in high school. And she was told that that would be fine as long as I could keep up. So my mother and I walked into the first rehearsal at DU, and I found myself in the company of fantastic singers, many of whom were former or current members of Westminster Choir College who had come out to spend the summer continuing their studies with Dr. Lynn. And I was stunned by the sounds that were coming into my ears. And aside from that, there was this magnetic personality that was at the podium. And I was so amazed by this entire experience that night as my mother was driving us home, I informed her that she had just lost a member of her church choir bass section because I had heard that Dr. Lynn, among other things, was returning to First Plymouth Congregational Church as its music director. And I explained to my mom that I just had to find out more about what was going on with these incredible sounds and this intriguing personality conducting. And so I think my mom saw that as no good deed goes unpunished. But I arranged to join the choir, and the first thing that Dr. Lynn did was seat me next to Dr. James Gentry, whom he told me, listen to what he does and do that. And Dr. Gentry had one of the most beautiful bass baritone voices on God's earth. And Dr. Lynn was renowned for telling people at Westminster Choir College that if they ever wanted to hear a perfect vowel, they needed to travel to Colorado and find one of the leading ophthalmologists and ask him to sing a few phrases for me. He just doesn't make an ugly sound. It's impossible. And for the next couple of months, I was just drooling in basking in the ambiance of Dr. Gentry's sounds and singing in the choir. And Dr. Gentry, shortly thereafter, started pestering Dr. Lynn to start teaching me voice privately. Dr. Lynn sort of ignored that until a month or two later when I was in the Colorado All-State Choir, which Dr. Lynn was also conducting as part of his Welcome Back to Colorado tour. And following that performance of 200-some singers, Lucille Lynn came up to me and told me with a big grin that she could hear my voice dominating the entire choir, at which point I was nonplussed and embarrassed that I wasn't blending properly. And she said, that has nothing to do with blending properly. And she then turned to her husband and said, George, you're teaching him Saturday at 10 a.m. And then with music provided by Dr. Gentry, none of which I ever returned to him, I went to my first lesson. I sang a 5-tone scale, la 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 la, at which point Dr. Lynn leaned back from the piano, took off his glasses, and he said, young man, you have an operatic voice. And I said, great, what's that? And following the end of the half-hour lesson, years later at Loretto Heights, some people who were studying with him were wondering why as voice majors they only got half-hour lessons as opposed to the hour lessons that students got with other teachers. Naturally, financial considerations came into that. Loretto couldn't afford to pay him properly. But he had a wonderful answer. He told someone, you couldn't survive an hour lesson.
There's some truth to that.
Yes. But following my first voice lesson, I stopped at a music store. You remember music stores? And this one had a huge section devoted to opera. And so I perused some books and some scores and then started looking at some recordings. LPs. You remember LPs?
Oh, yes.
And so the first album I looked at was a recording of Verdi's Rigoletto, which of course I couldn't pronounce. And it starred Cornell MacNeil, Joan Sutherland, and the bass was another unpronounceable name, the great Italian bass, Cesare Siepi. And then I looked at the next album, which was Boito's Mephistopheles, treatment of Faust where the devil actually gets the title role. And a couple of other names that I couldn't pronounce. Turns out they were very famous. Renata Tebaldi and Mario del Monaco with the soprano and tenor. But here was that Cesare Siepi again as the bass. And so I immediately, upon this wealth of information that I had now gathered about opera, leapt to two completely unfounded conclusions. One, the bass always has a very good part. And two, half of the time he has the lead. But what really intrigued me was the album cover of the Mephistopheles, which had Siepi ensconced in a golden throne wearing a cape, and he was being caressed by two of the most gorgeous half-naked women I'd ever seen. Remember, this was a long time ago, and there were certain standards about what was appropriate apparel for anything. And so the next day, I walked into the high school counselor because I decided that, man, if that's opera, that's for me. High school hormones are definitely in play. And told this counselor, I've got to drop that science class, I have to take another music class because I'm going to be a musician, because I want those two half-naked women. So obviously I was completely incorrect on all counts. But it shows how enthused I was by this first experience of working with him one-on-one. And by the time I had finished high school, I was so enamored of the work that I was doing with him that I went to Loretto Heights College to continue studying with him there. And I really cannot exaggerate the influence that he had on my musical and personal life. Without his guidance, I never would have figured out how to sing. I mean, I had a very interesting voice with lots of kinds of things, but when my voice changed for the final time, hopefully from soprano, mezzo, tenor, and my brief, albeit glorious career as a tenor, came to a crashing end after 7th grade. And during the night, I passed baritone and bass, and actually went even lower than the Russian octavists, who, like the string bass, sing everything an octave lower than the second basses do. And I could barely make sound on a low G in the bass clef, and I could make sound below the piano, which Worms appreciated, but nobody else did. So, you're talking about 32-foot organ pipe, that's sort of where I was. And with the difficulties in trying to let my voice move to places where composers had actually written music for anybody, let alone for soloists, without the patience that Dr. Lynn showed and the guidance for moving on after working with him to Dorothy DeScala, whom he had hired at the choir college, and she herself was a longtime protege of Sidney Deach, who had taught Leonard Warren, among other things, and who was the primary voice teacher at the Academy of Vocal Arts, the only conservatory in the world that all they do is train opera singers. Had he not sent me to DeScala to further my training, I definitely would not have been able to get hired by anybody, let alone by prestigious organizations throughout the world. So I guess I should also say that it wasn't just me, but my brother, Stephen, started studying with Dr. Lynn when he was a junior in high school. He also ended up going to Loretto Heights, and then after graduating, Dr. Lynn sent him to Houston to study with Elena Nicolaidi, who was mentioned earlier. And my mother eventually left the church that I and later Steve had abandoned to be singing in Dr. Lynn's church choir. And she followed us to First Plymouth and became Dr. Lynn's assistant and was in charge of the children's choir and the bell choirs and would play the organ or piano for us when we were doing large things that Dr. Lynn wanted to be conducting instead of conducting from the organ or piano himself. And then she went back, she joined us at Loretto to pick up a third degree herself, this time in music, which she'd spent so much of her life involved in but never had formal training in. And there was actually 1 year at Loretto where my brother, my mother, my ex-wife, and I were all there at the same time, which only begins to compare to the incredible involvement that the Gentry family has had with the Lynns. But it's been an amazing experience, and my entire family's life was rotated on a pivot once Dr. Lynn came into our lives. And it was something that all of us have continued to value throughout time.
Nice, very nice. A few years back, I was working on my master's, and the concentration was on, my thesis was life stories, telling your life stories and hearing people's life stories and the value and benefits of that. And I think just sitting in here for the last few hours today, my thesis is proved correct. It's just the value of listening to the stories of this man and his history and who he was to people is just astounding. And I think everyone sitting here can attest to what an amazing man he was and what he contributed to all our lives. So fast forward, let's go back in time. Fall of 1973, young man comes into Loretto Heights College, and it's gotta dance! Musical theater, that's who I am. So I come in to the world of Loretto Heights College with this amazing man at my side here, a few years ahead of me. I think you were 2 years ahead of me.
I graduated in '76.
76, I was so just a year ahead of me. He was just a year ahead of me. And I walk into my first class, one of my very first classes was mixed chorus with, of course, Dr. George Lynn. And I walk in, and at the time I was studying with another voice teacher at the college, Jan Sullivan, God rest her soul. She was training me as a tenor. I was on scholarship at Loretto Heights College for a music theater degree, and she was training me as a tenor. My voice, obviously, I had not quite done that change. Never did drop to the bass baritone. Actually, it did drop to the baritone. Never quite to the bass. But I spent my whole first year, two and a half years, being trained as a tenor by her. But anyway, my first class I walk into, and it's mixed chorus, and of course I walk into the room, and there is the likes of Dr. George Lynn, who I think it was Meredith said in the program, you know, there was just this fear when you walked in, and there was a fear when you walked in as a young musical theater boy for this very quote-unquote serious classical music that we were going to attempt. Scared the living daylights out of me. And I was out of my league, and yet at the same time filled with and brimmed with excitement and anticipation of what I could learn. So I spent my first semester learning the Messiah, the tenor part, which to this day is still in my head. But fast forward to my senior year, I go back and take mixed choir again. I don't know what happened sophomore and junior year. I did not take mixed choir. I was studying with Dr. Lynn at the time, but I did not take choir for some reason. I think I was in the midst of really concentrating on my degree. I don't know if you remember this. The year I went to Loretto Heights College, core requirements were dropped from the curriculum. So as theater students, we did not have to take math, science, humanities, philosophy, any of that. We did not have to take it. I, now looking back, foolishly thought, great, I don't have to take any of that. I didn't have to suffer through math. I didn't have to suffer through any of the sciences. But what I miss most now looking back is that I didn't take the philosophies, the psychologies, the humanities, art history, all the stuff that I have later since studied in life. But the beauty of that school, and Dr. Lynn being a huge part of it, was we concentrated on our music. We concentrated on our theater, and we concentrated on our dance. Okay, so I take the mixed chorus, and it's probably to this day, one of the most memorable experiences I had, singing down at the Air Force Academy. Every year we would combine with all the collegiate colleges, correct me if I'm wrong, Colorado Women's College, Colorado School of Mines, DU, Air Force Academy.
No DU.
No DU.
The other ones.
Air Force Academy and Loretto Heights College.
Yeah.
Did I miss anybody?
That was it.
That was it? And the 5 of us or 4 of us would congregate on the altar of the Air Force Academy and sing the Messiah. And I said, to this day, one of the most joyful experiences of my life, and beautiful. I think what's interesting is hearing what you all said today, the words that have been spoken today. I didn't realize at the time, but the rewards of wisdom that I was encountering in the years that I worked with Dr. Lynn. I mean, you think about by the time I got to him, as 1973 to 1977, all that had happened prior to me meeting him, and the wisdom that I was experiencing and being shared with was unbelievable. About midway through my college career, I didn't want to sing as a tenor. I didn't feel comfortable singing as a tenor. I felt I was singing out of my range, obviously. And my voice teacher always encouraged me, if you're ready, take the step. You can go to someone else. There'll be no problem with that. So I took the plunge, and I went to Dr. Lynn, and I spoke to him, and I asked if, in fact, I could switch and come over and study with him. Now, this is where I think I look at Dr. Lynn as a man of diversity. You look at the music, the cafeteria buffet of music that was last night and tomorrow night, and what we've heard today. Just amazing diversity. Well, in comes this musical theater boy that wants to study with him, and first I was afraid I was going to be told no. Secondly, I thought I was so intimidated by his presence my freshman year, but by this time I was a junior, had a little bit of seasoning under me, and had the courage to go in. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. I walked in and it was an embrace like you wouldn't believe. And it was a man who was, I think, a year older than my parents, my living parents at the time. Is it 1915, right?
Yeah.
Yes, my mom and dad were 1916. And I immediately felt this fatherly sense from him. And my father was a businessman and an artist as well, and a very gentle, loving man. I found that same thing in Dr. Lynn. So it was very, very comfortable for me because my dad was stern. He was a disciplinarian. He was a devout man, very, very devout Catholic. He was a businessman first, an artist second. And then I walk into this room and study with this man that had all those qualities and more and different than my father, and brought to me a level of understanding the arts that my father wasn't quite able to express to me, but Dr. Lynn could. And so it was a joyful union that I encountered in my junior year in college. And the thing I think that settles with me the most is that acceptance of who I was and what I was singing, the material I was singing, and not ever feeling always musical theater. Never ever felt that. The other thing that he brought to me was that he, of course, insisted that I sing all genres and that I sing everything. And I did. And I began singing in a way I've never sung before in the previous years. I started in high school as an amateur. Ended up with a scholarship to Loretto. Really didn't know a thing about music. Had never taken a music class in my life. So here I enter this school and begin my ear training, which I thought when I signed up for the class that we were going to sit in class and do something like this with Kathleen Joyner, who ended up being one of my all-time favorite teachers at Loretto Heights College. She too was an amazing inspiration in who I was. The other beautiful part about Dr. Lynn that I was introduced to was Lucille. And she was always just a studio away, yet always right there with the door open and would talk to you, and you could walk in her studio at any time and speak with her about life. She always asked questions about what I was doing in the theater department, what I was working on. So it was this amazing thing, and I continued that friendship years long after Dr. Lynn died with, of course, Tina and Lucille, who religiously, I could look out in the audience, and there they would be at my musical theater performances, and just carried on throughout my career. Just truly treasure that, Tina, and I treasure who your mom was, as well as your dad, of course, who we're here for, but your mother, I have to just stop for a second. And did anyone else, by the way, catch the similarity in the voices on the tape?
Yes.
I mean, that was ironic. You just listened to both of your voices and the clarity and the...
It's genetic.
It was definitely genetic, so beautiful job, beautiful job. So I think a couple of things I want to just say about him, and then I'll turn it back to you. Would you rather take over for a little bit?
Oh, you're doing very well.
A couple of things I really, really want to emphasize about Dr. Lynn was, it's a touchy subject, and Tina touched on it, his relationship with the other faculty and where he fit in on a faculty. And he was a stern, harsh man in a sense, but all of us that knew him knew the teddy bear and the lovely man that he was. And I think we all know, most of you here on faculty and in the educational world, myself being a teacher all my career as well, know that teachers are pit up against each other sometimes. Sometimes not by their choice, sometimes it's ego, sometimes it's circumstances. It's always something that puts you in a situation where it can be difficult or you tread lightly. Here's the thing that I most admired about him. I was in a very difficult situation leaving the voice teacher I left, who was the one that brought me into the college on scholarship. It created a situation that was very, very difficult my last year and a half of my college years. So this is where I have to commend Dr. Lynn and for what he did and how he handled the situation and how he handled me and how he taught me to accept, how he taught me to forgive, and how he taught me to just move on from this situation, and that you're going to face many of these situations in your career, either with a director, a fellow actor, a choreographer, whoever it is, the accompanist, musical director, you've got to be able to still deal with that person and you've got to rise above it. And he helped me through that. He and Dr. Richard Clark, who was another, the theatrical professor that we had, were the two that were very instrumental in helping me become the person I would become later in my career. And that's someone that was able to tolerate the intolerable and to work through a situation that was difficult and challenging and know that I could get through it if I was going to be the gentleman I was. And that's what he was. That's the biggest thing he had in common with my father, was he was such a gentleman. Okay? The second thing was the passion that the man brought to the table. I think one of my, I have in one of the yearbooks, which I meant to bring today, there's a great picture of him conducting us in the Messiah. And you just know, you just saw that face and how he lit up when he was bringing someone in or he was bringing another group in. Just the passion and the excitement that he would bring to the stage. I, of course, went on to be a high school teacher and a college professor myself. I went back to Loretta Heights College and taught. Unbelievable to go back and have that experience as well. So to take that sort of learned man's abilities and lessons and put them in my own teaching was something that really became an instrumental part of who I became as a teacher and a performer. I'll go with more later.
Well, I think one of the things you touched on, and you did a bit too, was a side of George that a lot of people might not have known unless you were very close to him. He has this image when you go up to him that he's a kind of a rough and tough guy, but he wasn't. He had the biggest heart in the entire world. I mean, he would go miles for people to make them successful. And one of the things I remember most was that you've got to remember this was in the 60s and things like this just weren't supposed to happen. But in Westminster Choir, a couple got pregnant. And they were practically shunned by all of the students. Dr. Lynn took them into his house. Their wedding was done there, and he had a reception for them. And this marriage is still going. I mean, this was incredible. And Lucille, too. I mean, they were both together. So let's talk a bit about the kinder, gentler side of George that you might.
I'm going to pretend that I'm running for president and say, first let me address something that my opponent, something that Michael said about dealing with politics and other teachers and jealousies and various things like that. Dr. Lynn told me that when he returned to Westminster Choir College as music director, he agreed to do that only upon the condition that he would also be appointed head of the voice and conducting departments, because he knew that absent that, he would be dealing with politics that he just didn't have any time for. And he went on to relate to me the first meeting that the voice faculty had with him there as not only music director, but as head of the voice department. And he could just see all the trepidation that, oh, he's going to come in, he's going to take my prize student, he's going to do this and that. And instead, he opened the discussion by saying, tell me about your problem students. Tell me about the people that you feel that for whatever reason, you're just not reaching them. And let me ask you if you would like to have me work with them for a while, and you can have your pick of whoever the incoming students are, or whatever. And after they gasped, he said, well, I've got several you could take right here. And then after a semester or two, several of the voice faculty came up to him and said, I can't believe the fantastic progress that these people have made. You know, they're now at a point that I think I could actually help them now. He said, fine, go ahead and take it. You have another problem student? He had no sense of ego in these particular situations. He was willing to do anything for the betterment of the students and for the program. He hated politics, but when he did engage, he believed in preemptive action. Set up the conditions so that people find themselves in a place where they can't turn away from a win-win. And that was truly amazing. I agree that he's had an immensely generous soul, and he would always astonish me with how well he knew what was going on with individual members of his large choirs. Somebody's got a family situation, somebody's got a challenge academically, someone has got an illness. He somehow knew about that. He had a real sense of the pulse of it. And this was one of the ways that he was able to establish such an emotional connection with the members of his choirs that they were able to sing better than they knew how at the moment. Obviously, he espoused the philosophy of Williamson in terms of tone and looking for something extraordinary in someone and pulling it out to them and showing it manifesting within their voice. It was amazing. But I think, as Dr. Ely alluded to at one of the sessions the other day, he would often be so self-deprecating that one could actually lose sight of the fact that he himself was not just someone spouting off the philosophies of John Fiddler Williamson, but he had, in fact, done what he aspired for all of his own students. He had become better than his own masters. And I believe that anyone who's been attending these sessions and who's heard the music last night and is let alone familiar with other parts of his work, there is no question that George Lynn is one of the great music masters of the world. I would describe to people that I would talk about how, well, I've got a little bit of disappointment that maybe I didn't know him when he was at Westminster. And he had told me that I probably actually would have been selected for the touring choir, Westminster Choir, as a freshman, which was all but unheard of. But I realized that no matter what success I might have had at that time, I never would have had the same kind of personal relationship that I had with him in Colorado, because there just wasn't time. Now, I've heard from all kinds of people who studied with him at Westminster, conductors and singers and organists, about the wonderful personal relationships that they had. And it's the same kind of thing. But when it comes just to the number of hours that I was able to spend with him on sometimes a daily basis, having meals with him, riding in his car, as Dr. Gentry, the younger, alluded to the other day, sitting in cars for hours on ends with these discussions, it was just extraordinary. None of that could have happened if he didn't have a personal relationship with his students.
So I'm going to interject if I can, Greg. Personal story. It was my senior year. I decided, because I was studying with him again, that I would do mixed choir again. And the amazing thing was I went back into the choir at that time and learned the bass baritone part. So now I can sing anything in the Messiah if you want. I can do the tenor or baritone bass part. But it was a whole new experience and a whole wonderful experience that I got. And comfortable.
Yeah.
And it was amazing to me. And so that was very joyful for my senior year. Then the second story is fast forward to my final semester. And again, I'm not blowing my horn, but I was Mr. Musical Theater in the department. I was one of the boys that was...
You were.
She was there, and I loved it. It was my life, and it still is my life.
Great.
And I was unethically told that I was going to do the lead in the musical. It's one of those things that, great lesson, and I'll tell you a couple things about it, that I've taken into my teaching. I was, quote unquote, promised the role, right? Something I would never ever do to one of my students and never have. Fast forward to the audition, second semester, senior year, glorious career I've had at this college. I don't get the role. The musical is Carnival, and I wasn't cast as Paul. I was cast as Head Roustabout in the chorus. Biggest heartbreaking thing of my college career. Huge. So I go back to my voice lesson in tears, and I tell him what happened. he spent the whole lesson, we didn't even sing that day. He talked me through what life is about. This is where my father came back in. This is where the real person came in that I later, as you said, all those times we had with him, you learn the lessons later in life, that teacher that told you this, that told you that. It had such a profound effect on me. Prior to that, I had removed my name from the cast list. Very immature, but I was so distraught and so upset. Dr. Clark, the other one I spoke to, pulled me into the library, and he said, I hate to tell you this, but if you do not accept this role, we will not allow you to graduate this semester. So I was faced with this decision. Take all of this into Dr. Lynn, talk this through. And of course, I stood up in the library, I'll never forget as long as I live, and I threw my pen out the table, and I said, Dr. Clark, I will do this show, and I'll be the best damn hit roustabout you've ever seen. And I did, and I went on to sing and dance in the chorus, and I had the time of my life, and I didn't get the role I wanted, but the lesson I got in the studio and from Richard Clark and from Dr. Lynn was, welcome to the real world. Fast forward 20 years later, my first Broadway show in New York, glorious. I called my mom and dad, it's right before my father passed away. I got to hear in their voice that I got the Broadway show. A month before we opened on Broadway, the marquee's up, I have a picture of me under it. Show's canceled. So I was prepared though. I was prepared. I'd spent a life of disappointments, as we all know in the theater and in the world of the music and theater, that it's a life of disappointments. When it's great, it's great. When it's not, it's not. And the man should be the same in both situations. And that's one of the things he taught.
Hearing you describe the audition and the promised role reminds me that while at Loretto, and Loretto, like the high school when I was at Cherry Creek, they both had unbelievable drama departments. And yet, at neither place was I ever involved in the production, with the sole exception of a couple of years of Amal and the Night Visitors at Loretto. But,
Surprise, surprise.
yeah, I've never gotten the black grease that they had all over my skin for the first year's production of Amal when I was Balthazar, the Nubian king. Anyway, Loretto was going to do a production of, and did do a production of Nana La Mancha. And I decided that I could just barely find a way to squeeze in enough time to be involved in the production. And so I decided that I would audition. And the night before the audition, I got a phone call from Dr. Lynn, which was not unusual. I usually heard from him at least once a day by phone if I wasn't seeing him, or regardless of whether I was going to be seeing him in person. And he said, I understand you're planning on auditioning for La Mancha. Yes. I think that would be a very bad idea. Why? Because they're going to cast you as Quixote. I said, I'm auditioning for the innkeeper. They're going to cast you as Quixote, and you can't sing it. I know I can't sing it. I'm auditioning for the innkeeper. And he said, they will cast you as Quixote. Don't audition. Okay. And he was right. They would have. And instead, John Ryan, I believe, did a fantastic job as Cervantes. But then the other part of this, when you were talking about going in, sorry, Larry, about him consoling you and giving you advice about stuff. When my wife and I divorced, who was also a student at Loretto, and many of our classes had like 4 people in them, so it would be like 2 people and my soon-to-be ex-wife. So, among the people that really reached out to me were Dr. Gentry the Elder and Dr. Lynn. And Dr. Lynn, I don't know if you ladies remember this, but he invited me out to your house for a weekend to spend nights. And he basically said,
don't touch my daughters.
Remind me to never be on the stage with you. He said, time will dull things. In the meantime, I want you to focus on it. And he went to the file cabinets and the closets and started pulling out music. Let's see how this fits your voice. And of course, nothing would fit my voice because it was still down here. But it was a wonderful exercise in distraction. And just knowing that anything that we were there doing, whether I was sitting in a chair looking at some stuff while he was composing, whether we were on walks around the neighborhood, just everything about his approach to helping me heal, again returns to your question, what about the personal and the kindly, as H.W. was kindler, gentler part of his soul. But I also think that we have to talk about some of the things about just what he was as a teacher. His methods of drawing out the voices and the artistic inspiration in the singers was so extraordinary. Because he himself had such a tremendous sense of curiosity about all kinds of things, he was able to discover some information about a student and then immediately begin relating things to that student's extant experience so that they would have a context to build upon as they were discovering how to sing or play the organ or whatever. For example, my brother played the trombone. And so when he was taking voice lessons, he would often have analogies, well, when you're playing the trombone and you're doing it, not so much with me with flute and piccolo, but definitely with my brother and the trombone. I was involved in competitive speech in my senior year of high school, and so I would ask him if he would listen to me reciting Mark Twain's The War Prayer or doing speeches from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And then, after he would make various comments about things, a couple months later, I would be put on the spot at the Ghost Ranch seminars when he was talking to the choir directors assembled about the similarities between speaking voices and singing voices. And he would say, you, come here, recite some of that poem. You know, or you're doing the wild man who's coming in pretending he's the messenger of God. And so, I am the messenger of the Lord Most High. He said, you see, that's his singing voice. And he was always looking for things to excite the students so that they would not have a sense ever of, oh, I've got to go to choir, oh, I can't wait for my next lesson, I can't wait to get into this choir. You knew you were part of something. And I also want to relate one of the first times that I heard Westminster Choir was from an old monaural reel-to-reel tape recording of the Elijah that you referenced in First Press in Philadelphia with McCurdy playing. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with who McCurdy was, or his predecessor, Carl Weinrich, who was also mentioned earlier as Dr. Lynn's organ teacher. But McCurdy was an organist, just an astonishing organist. And the organ that he was playing in First Press had been built to his specifications. So I'm listening to this recording in my parents' family room, which had a vaulted ceiling and fortunately was far away from the bedrooms where everybody was asleep. And we had these big cannibalized Sears Roebuck speakers from a high fidelity system before there was stereo, but this was great the way we had set it up. And Elijah begins with a very brief, as Dr. Gentry, the elder, well knows, very brief recitative. Draw near, all you people come. And then the actual overture begins. And so I had the volume set, and it sounded fine for the first little recitative, and then I couldn't hear a thing. And so I'm jacking up the volume until it's at 10. And now I can hear McCurdy. McCurdy, by the way, played from the orchestra score. He did not play from the piano vocal score as he's playing this stuff. And so, as the overture goes on, it gets louder and louder, and the orchestra, more and more instruments coming in, well, more and more stops, crescendo pedal, all this stuff. By the end of the overture, the house is shaking, and it's on 0.1 on the volume. It's just so amazing. Then the choir comes in, and you can't hear the organ. That was Westminster Choir. It was filled with voices singing to their potential. Nothing was constraining. And that kind of sound, including at Westminster these days, has vanished. One of the few places that embraced that and went on and found its own manifestations, but had that sense of releasing voices, was Dr. Ifili's choirs at the Conservatory at Kansas City.
And now it's CU.
I was just going to say that. I said,
Let me finish my thought. No jumping ahead. But that's exactly right. I had the privilege just a couple of weeks ago of hearing Dr. Gentry the Younger's choir singing, rehearsing Prairie Sunset, Cecil Effinger. And it was such a joy to hear people singing with no sense of vocal apprehension, no sense of effort. Instead, the joy of this release of singing. It's amazing. And you can't do that unless you have embraced one of Dr. Lynn's favorite sayings, which is that one of his many, many, many favorite sayings. Your voice must always be huge and gently produced, no matter what. So it doesn't matter whether it's a soft dynamic or a loud dynamic.
soft dynamic, loud dynamic.
No, soft dynamic, loud dynamic. It's the same thing. Anything else would be like starting to play Rachmaninoff's prelude in what is C sharp minor, something like that, with the big crashing octaves, boom, 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 right? Huge fortissimo markings, and then the next thing is double piano. Well, that would be like being on a Bösendorf or a Hamburg Steinway 9-foot, and you're playing big crashing chords, and then you turn to a little toy piano for the next thing because, oh, it's got to be soft now. No, it's soft, but it's still huge. It's loud, no, it's loud, but it's still gently produced. Regardless of dynamic, regardless of tempo, doesn't matter. The voice has to be present. When you have a room full of 200 plus voices that live by that philosophy, it's no longer a case of singing with a professional orchestra and the orchestra constantly being told, you have to play softer. You know, I know we got 500 people up there, but we just can't hear anything. Please be softer. The wind players can barely make any sound come out because they're sucking in. But with Westminster Choir, the orchestra has to ask them to take pity on them because the orchestra can obliterate the orchestra, but the choir can obliterate the orchestra. That is something that has to be experienced to be believed. And that's the kind of thing that when I heard a touring choir from Kansas City at Cherry Creek the last year I was teaching there in '76, it was like, wow, it's really true. 40 voices sound like 400. And that's what I hear with Dr. Gentry the Younger's choirs here, is this sense of, yes, it's all about possibilities and not some kind of handicap situation where you rob from this and rob from that and come up with what Dr. Lynn would call an anemic paste pretending to be a blend. So, I'd also just like to make one other quick little point, I'm sorry, but Dr. Lynn told me that when he was a young man studying organ with Carl Weinrich, and Weinrich was, well, of course, these days a lot of people don't even know who Virgil T. Fox was, but Weinrich was the first person hired to record all of Bach's organ works. And it was like studying with the god of organ. And so Dr. Lynn was practicing 8+ hours a day and doing all these things. And at that point, he was taken up to New York to have a consultation with the Metropolitan Opera as a singer. And he blew them away. And they offered him the opportunity to study under their tutelage and guidance for 5 years, and then they would present him as Siegmund in Die Walküre. And Dr. Lynn said, "Thank you very much, I'm an organ major." And returned to the choir college. And then after doing a big recital and looking out and seeing 6 people in the audience, said, you know, why am I wasting my time doing this? And then he turned away from that and started focusing on composition and choral music. And I think what this shows is that it seemed to never impress him if someone was offering him something that was sort of bright lights and fame. Instead, he was drawn to the things that compelled him to be participating in those activities. And I think that his ability to excite that same kind of desire to learn and explore and be brave in the world and not be hemmed in by other people's restrictions. You were talking about mavericks. And he was able to instill in his students an understanding that within them was a divine spark that they were able to then go out and do wondrous things. He didn't want people to be an imitation of himself. One of the few comments he ever made about my conducting was, just because I conduct like my arms are wrapped around the barrel doesn't mean that you have to as well. And all that he wanted for his students was joy. Joy in everything. And he consistently would provide them with the tools to achieve just that.
Well, I think we have to quit at that. Said beautifully. I agree with all of that. Do I have a minute to tell a funny story?
Go ahead.
Just because I want to end on a
Yes.
When we were auditioning for Westminster Choir, the bunch of us, there were 3 first tenors. 2 of us were organ majors. And you might ask why were organ majors there? Well, we went to audition completely on a dare. The 3rd floor dorm men got together and dared us to do it. So we thought, but, you know, we'll go sing for them. Mind you, we're scared to death of them. So we went and sang. Can you imagine what happened when those two of these tenors got accepted into this choir? Oh my God, what did I get myself into? But, and this was years and years later, sitting in our living room. He had this whiskey in his hand, and I said, I finally wrapped up the courage to ask him, I said, how did you ever accept Huey and I into your choir? He said, well, there wasn't much choice.